next speaker. John has been collecting beer steins for almost 30 years. He started collecting steins to have some extras for friends to use when they came to visit. In 1968, he saw an ad for SCI, and after spending many hours talking with Thomas Bowen on the phone, was pleased to find that there were others with the same affliction. John loves all types of steins, but his favorites are glass, early steins, and drinking vessels made from natural items, like coconut, eggs, corn, ivory, and wood. John was awarded the title of Master Steinologist in 1988. He believes that the friends he made through stein collecting are worth far more than the steins themselves. In his real life, he is a counselor at Frederick Community College in Frederick, Maryland. He and his wife Judy live in a 200-year-old restored log home, where they also have an antique shop. Without further ado, I would like to present John Stuart.
Microphone work? Yeah. Thank you very much, Robin and the Keysteiners and my fellow Stein collectors and my good friends. And when I say my good friends, I mean that sincerely. This is my 23rd straight convention, and for every time I come, it really is like a family reunion. This is also my third or fourth convention in a row where they've asked me to give one of the talks. And I was really feeling honored about that until last week when I saw the movie Groundhog Day on TV. And I think you know the premise where you keep having to relive the event over and over until you get it right. So, honest, Robin, I'll do my best, so maybe this will be the last time for a while for you all. Giving a talk at an SCI convention is very much like being Elizabeth Taylor's latest husband on the wedding night. You're under a lot of pressure to get it right. You know that you will be compared to some very important people. But on the positive side, you'll have a lot of people with experience who you can call for help. My talk today is going to be on early stoneware. Good. Early stoneware. There's wonderful pieces that are rich in history and tradition. I'm going to focus on stoneware, steins, and drinking vessels made from the 1500s to the end of the 1700s. Actually, stoneware steins is a redundancy. The very word stein comes from the German word Steinzug, which means stoneware. Other than the term glass, no other manufacturing material and its form are more closely intertwined. But what is stoneware? How did they make it? Who made it? Why did they make it? Where did they make it? I guess you're wanting me to answer those questions. Stoneware is made from special clay that is rich in either flint or feldspar, and which is fired to at least 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the feldspar and the clay melts and fuses together. This melting is called sintering. The hard sintered body is impermeable to liquids, either with or without blades. It can't be cut or scratched even with steel, and is impervious to all acids except hydrochloric acid. Poor clays will not produce stoneware, and regardless of the quality of clay, insufficient heat will not produce stoneware. Ceramics were made in the Cologne region as early as the Roman times, occupations. But as we move into the Middle Ages, we see an interest in improving quality and obviously to improve marketability. The goal of the potters was to maintain a workable clay that would be plastic and pliable enough to easily shape, would still yield very predictable results in the kiln, and would also form a much harder, more durable product. Potters kept adjusting the clays and improving the firing techniques in this search. It is felt that the process of making true stoneware was accomplished as early as the 13th century along the Rhine River. The potters also noticed when they were firing the stoneware that items that were inadvertently covered with some alkaline ash So after a lot of experimentation over time, they felt that they could duplicate, or they found that they could duplicate that appearance by throwing salt into the kiln when the kiln had reached its highest temperature. And that forms that salt glaze Stoneware. The heat vaporized the salt, which is sodium chloride, and the sodium combined with the silicic acid in the clay to form actually soda glass. So the covering of the salt glaze piece is actually soda glass. The water driven off by the clay as it was being dried was also formed with the chlorine. Since the sodium joined the clay, the chlorine was free. Hydrogen from the water that was being vaporized formed together to form hydrochloric acid. That hydrochloric acid vapor, as it left the kiln, also started etching away at the surface of the stoneware that was just, or the salt glaze that was just created. And that's the reason you have that orange peel texture that you can tell on stoneware. That's the result of that hydrochloric acid etching part of the surface of the glaze away as it leaves the kiln. The color of the clay depends on its purity and depends on the number of minerals that are in the clay or minerals that are added to the clay. The color also greatly depends on whether you're using oxidation firing, which means that ample oxygen is allowed into the kiln, and it's also used on reduction firing, which means that limited oxygen is allowed into the kiln. That greatly affects the color of the clay. That is briefly the how. I'm not going to go into any more of the technical aspects of making stoneware, both because I don't want to bore you, and B, the more honest answer is I really don't know anything more technical than that. What I will do, however, is to look at the other aspects of stoneware. My goal is to help identify where the steins were made by the characteristics of the materials used. Different regions had different clays, had different glazes, and also had different styles of decorating that were common and liked in that particular region. I'm going to focus on steins from the most commonly seen stoneware factories in towns. When I talk about a factory, and talk about like Westerwald or Annenberg or whatever, I don't mean that there was just one potter or one factory. We're talking about a town. There was a lot of cooperation, even though there was competition, there was a lot of cooperation between the potters of the town. You know, that more, okay, we're check. The Rhine region became the first primary stoneware producer in Germany. There were excellent clay deposits and plenty of wood to fuel the kilns. The Rhine itself was a highway to bring in materials like salt and to export the finished products like the stoneware products when they were complete. Cologne was the first earliest producing center. Now I had planned to have a map up here that I could show you different areas. What I'll do is I'll back up and talk maybe about the characteristics as we go through. The item on the left, They also produced the bearded man jugs, the Bartman Krügs, and since they use some of the same clay pits as the Cologne potters, it is frequently very difficult to differentiate between the two. And the towns are usually listed together as Cologne-Frechen when the stoneware is described. Another town, which was southeast of Cologne, was Siegburg. It was an early abbey town. The potter's craft there reached its peak from 1550 to 1600. Their clay pits produced a pure white clay which retained its whiteness even after firing. It had a very fine grain that allowed it to be pressed into molds with very delicate details. These thin molded medallions or panels and it's usually very tall, cylindrical, slightly tapered, narrow at the top and the bottom. Usually has several bands at the bottom and top. And then this panel, which was sort of rolled out like cookie cutter dough and impressed with a mold, that is wrapped around the body of the stein. So this is a Seaberg piece from the 1500s. In 1586, 1587, troops moving through the town of Seaberg destroyed a lot of the potter's workshops. But they continued on in business even at diminished capacity. But its final demise occurred when the Swedish troops destroyed the city in 1632. Raritan was another early Rhineland stoneware town and is now part of Belgium. Here, potter's workshops existed as early as the 1100s, but its golden age of stoneware production ran from 1550 to the early 1600s. Its stoneware clay had a mineral content that turned light tan to gray on firing. It was also frequently glazed with loam under salt glaze that produced a nice nutty brown color. The steins and decorations range from very plain ridges or just a grooved band to a central medallion to very complex shapes, some with highly detailed scenes. Here you see a number of different processes. This is stamping, this is molding, this is an applied shield on here. Again, a very large piece with a lot of detail to it. The last stoneware region along the Rhine was the Westerwald, which centered around Bourg, Grenshausen, and Grenzow, which is about 20 miles east of Koblenz. In 1590, a guild was formed between the local potters and the refugee potters that had come from Seaberg and Raritan. There in the Westerwald, they had a wonderful gray stoneware clay. It could be thrown on a wheel, molded, or incised, and formed true hard stoneware that lent itself a wonderful background for cobalt blue and manganese purple colored decoration. And here you see both the manganese. This is a rare piece, but you'll see manganese and cobalt also used on rare pieces. The Westerwald region didn't just go east of Koblenz in the Grenshausen area. It extended a very large region over a very large region all the way to Steinau in the province of Hesse. Of all the major stoneware centers in Europe in the 15, 16, and 1700s, the Westerwald is the only region that's still producing today. Another major stoneware center was the small town of Preußen, which is near Bayreuth. Preußen's potters used a reddish clay which turned dark gray to olive brown to brown on firing. It was given a satin brown to a black brown finish when glazed with black salt and fired with resinous pine wood. Most Preußens have molded relief designs that were frequently highlighted by the full range of enamel colors. One of the most common motifs was a religious design with the apostles. The church was a huge religious and political force in the 15 and 1600s. Paul Preuning, a Hafnerware potter, was arrested and convicted in Nuremberg in 1541 for having made a jug with a crucifixion alongside scenes of musicians and peasants dancing. Political correctness, 1500s version. In addition to the apostle crews, we see Preußens featuring the planets, shields, coats of arms, hunting scenes, and the very rare cornucopia or horn of plenty signs. Preußens were all salt clays. There were also deposits of stoneware clay in the central and east regions of Germany. The oldest and most important central German pottery center was Waldenburg in the Zwickau Basin. It had a potter's guild as early as 1388. That's the Waldenburg piece here. It had a potter's guild, like I said, as early as 1388, but the best stoneware was produced there from 1550 to 1630. Despite it being a very tiny town, there were 42 master potters in the local guild between 1600 and 1650. This did not include apprentices, family workers, or casual laborers. So you can see that it really was an important industry in that town. Northwest of Waldenburg, we come to Altenburg. This town produced excellent high-quality steins from about 1625 to the early 1800s. The light gray clay, that's this stein, was most frequently covered with a creamy white glaze, as this one is on the left, or a thin orange-brown glaze. They were often decorated with applied clay beads or glazed beads in folk art designs called pearl pumpkins, and that's what this is. These are little pearl beads added to this, and this is a scene of a stag with some vines and hearts and things like that. And some glazed enamel beads in the blue, and sometimes are purple. Next we come to Annenberg, and Annenberg's on the right-hand side of the screen. It was a producer in Saxony near the current border with Czechoslovakia. The clay is dark and gray-brown to dark brown under a shiny lead glaze. The clay was not as good there in the region, so it did not center or fuse together. A glaze was required. Annenberg pieces were usually decorated with chip carving, applied or molded relief with polychrome enamels with rulers, religious, or folk art scenes. The bodies are more frequently pear-shaped, as this one is. Although colored and enameled like Preußenstein's, the origin or difference between the two can be determined by the glaze. Shiny lead glaze, Annenberg; matte salt glaze, Preußen. Annenberg's potters generally worked from the 1630s to the mid-1700s. Freiburg was another Saxon stoneware town southwest of Dresden. Don't have a picture of Freiburg here. It was gray to olive brown stoneware under a salt glaze, decorated with chip carving, pressed and applied relief designs, and polychrome enamel and geometric patterns. The enamel is fairly thick and frequently has a glassy appearance. Bodies were often slightly tapered, bulbous, or pear-shaped, and the pewter lid is often thin, hand-hammered pewter relief. Production there ranged from 1620 to 1690. Muskow is in the Lusatian region near the Nisi River, and it produced medium to gray-brown true stoneware with brown, blue, and purple painted body designs under salt glaze. Items were decorated with cut, stamped, or relief work in a geometric, floral, or folk art design. Some steins have squat, cylindrical shape, but more commonly had large bulbous or pear-shaped bodies, frequently with diagonal lines or ridges in a band above the base. Production was from the mid-1600s to the late 1700s. Bunzlau is in Lower Silesia, currently Poland. This piece, the green piece, is a Bunzlau piece. The clay is light tan under shiny medium brown iridescent painted clay slit glaze. It was not truly sintered stoneware, so it did require glaze. They were often decorated with a cream color, applied relief flowers, or shields, or double-headed eagles. Steins were usually larger than 1 liter. The bodies were frequently bulbous or pear-shaped, and less frequently melon-shaped, lobed with brown or green glaze. This is one of the melon, lobe, green glaze pieces. Production ran from the mid-1600s to the early 1800s. These are the who's and the where's. Please remember there are very few absolutes when identifying the source and age of early stoneware beer steins. As we have just discussed, it was common to have potters, artists, and factory owners move for religious, political, or economic reasons. The techniques used in making and decorating steins and drinking vessels were shared, sold, and stolen by many individuals and factories throughout time. I'm going to look at some of the slides showing the characteristics of the different factories and towns. Then I'm going to use some actual examples and give you a quiz to see how much you learned from these slides. On the tables, I've made a handout which includes the bulk of the major stoneware factories in Germany from the 15, 16, and 1700s. Now, it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to follow along with the lights darkened the way they are, but I did bring this so that you could use it. And I've done them alphabetically, which will make it a little bit easier to find. Stein collectors are strange people, as we all know. Stoneware was made in plates, bowls, cups, vases, all different kinds of things. Almost always we will totally ignore those. We're interested in steins. In fact, I may have said at one of the other meetings that I gave a talk at, the story of a stein collector, and they bring about priests who died at the exact same instant, and because of that they were transported to heaven at the same time. And St. Peter met them at the gate and asked each of them their name. They gave them their name, and St. Peter said, "Yes, you're on the list, please come inside." They walked in to heaven. It was absolutely unbelievable. They walked about 3 blocks and saw this magnificent castle. It was the most beautiful thing in the world. It would rival any of Ludwig's castles or any of the castles of the French king. There were marble, silk tapestries, choirs of angels, gold and silver. It was absolutely phenomenal. And he told the stein collector, "This will be your eternal home." Then he takes the priest, and they but how come the Stein collector gets that castle and very devout priest only gets the shack? He says, I realize that it may seem very unfair, but you have to realize up here in heaven, we have tens of thousands of devout priests. But this is the first Stein collector, so it's not going directly to hell. Just for some interest, the one on the right is a Saxon piece, a wonderful Stein. The one in the middle is a Bavarian, a Stoneware piece. The one on the left is a piece from Silesia. First is Altenburg. You'll notice on here some very common characteristics. The applied white clay beads, the enameled glazed beads. Altenburg usually had very nice pewter. You'll see that it had a base, or a place for a belly band here, here, and here. There would have been about 7 rings on the sign. Most of them have very nice fancy leaves. And you'll see that typical orangish brown glaze. Another characteristic, they have a very flat strap handle, often with a very grainy or sandy texture to it. This is another Altenburg piece, again, from the same time period, 1725 to 1750. You'll see these a little applied clay rosette. There's approximately 800 of them on there. As I said in one of my talks the other day, that's what happens when you sit around drinking beer a lot at night, and you figure like, well, geez, I have to justify why I'm setting up this late. Well, I'll count the beads on my son. This is also an Altenburg piece. A little bit earlier time period, notice that it's the same typical white surface, but no applied beads. This is another Altenburg piece. Notice the wonderful brown color. This is hourglass shape, but we do see on here that it does have the same flat strap handle, and it would if we could feel it, would have that nice grainy texture. A lot of cut and stamp design on here. Very attractive piece. This is a nice enameled Altenburg piece. Also the hourglass shape. Again, notice the handle. They're most likely, this is either stamped or chip carved, and then it's enameled on there. This is a little bit earlier piece. This is right around 1700. This is a wonderful piece that has just a wonderful shape to it. This is earlier. This is probably 1650 to 1660. Notice the wonderful folk art enameling, sort of the pinwheel effect. And you'll also notice on here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 belly bands of pewter, plus a lip rim, plus the lid, and the nice mounts on here. Like I said, a lot of Altenburg pieces have wonderful. This is another Altenburg piece, white glaze, and then this over top of that they have done the enameling. And again, you'll see some characteristic belly bands of pewter on here. Now, I would say most of the time, probably only 1 or 2 of the bands remain. It's very hard to find one with them intact, all intact. This also listed as Altenburg. This is from Rochlitz, Linzau, which is right in that area. A number of people produced signs that had the same two-tone effect, the light creamy clay at the top and the red-brown glaze at the bottom. And Newington made pieces that look like this. This is a salt plate piece. We sort of more safely say this is a Saxon piece than attributing it specifically to Rochlitz. This is an Anneberg piece. Now, Anneberg, if you'll look on your handout, some of the characteristics there were the clay's dark and gray brown, the dark brown, with an ongoing solidified finish under smooth, shiny lead glaze. And it's not truly centered stoneware, which means it didn't fuse together, so therefore glaze was required. Remember I said earlier about the color characteristics and enamel characteristics being similar to Croyson? Take a look as we go through these Annebergs, and then later we will compare this to the Croyson pieces. This is chip carved. All these little dots here were specifically just gouged out separately, oftentimes with applied a beautiful piece. You can see very easily all the chip carving. Very nice pewter. Exquisite piece. And we're talking 1675, 1680 time period. Same thing for this Annenberg piece, maybe possibly a little bit earlier. One of the common misconceptions when people talk about early steins, and people will look at something that's relatively crude and assume that that's the earlier piece. That's not necessarily so at all. Usually in the early days of a pottery, after the potter had really developed his skill, that was when they were the most inventive, most creative, and paid the most attention to detail. So ordinarily, the earlier pieces have the most amount of detail and work to them as opposed to the later pieces. As they got working, you could imagine turning out pots for 25 years. You're not going to have the same enthusiasm to deal with all of the tiny details that you would have had in your second, third, fourth, or fifth year of production. This is a very unusual Annenberg piece. It's sort of a turquoise blue color. It has some applied bears here, rosettes, and a nice shield. These are very, very scarce steins. Come in this particular, anywhere from pale blue to almost a turquoise color. And to me are very, very attractive. Next we move to Bunzlau on your list. Bunzlau is in Lower Silesia, currently Poland. Clay there is light tan under shiny to medium brown iridescent glaze. It's often decorated with cream color applied relief flowers or birds, as in this case. As I said earlier, usually the size is larger than 1 liter. Typically the shape is this bulbous or pear shape. This piece is late 1700, 1780 to 1800 time period. Another Bunzlau piece, notice the nice applied relief and the milky color, creamy color on here. This is a, might say 1750, 1760 piece. Also about dating. You can put any date on a lid. When you see dates on the bodies, as we will in the Croissants, it is much more accurate than on the lid. Anybody can engrave any date on the lid. I might give you a present, and I might put your birth date on it. I might put the date that I give it to you. I might put the date of 10 years in advance, which is when you're going to have your 25th anniversary. None of those things are done fraudulently. None of those people that were sitting at that time doing it thought that stein collectors would be sitting around in a room 200 years later trying to see if it actually was 1698 or was it actually 1701. This is a Bunzlau piece, also the melon or loaf shape with the sort of the unusual, the green glaze on it. This is the Bunzlau clay. A lot of times we tend to think that Bunzlaus are round because of the typical coating cover. They're not. This is the color of the clay. This is a real early piece. This is from Cologne or Frechen. This is from the late 1500s. The characteristic of the Bartman group, the bearded man with a band of relief around the waist and some applied medallions. Notice also this sort of speckled color. This is another speckled piece. This is called a tigerware jug. This was made in the Cologne region in the mid-1600s. These silver mounts were added later in this particular case in England in the late 1800s, although in the English time period they were also, in the 1500s, were also doing the same thing. So the silver on here is a copy of 1500 silver. Again, you can see the color of the clay is not the brown that you would think by looking at the surface. The color of the gray is actually a pale gray color. Now we start into the Croissant pieces, and remember these were salt clays. This is a highly enameled piece, and also very typical. This had the fossils, and it also had a shield or crest on here, and a band or slogan of writing. This has a planet motif. This is a shroud flashen, or a ring jar, a screw jar, and these were the bottles that could be carried places storing liquid. Very elegant piece. This is a nice early Croissant. Notice again it has that black salt, dark salt glaze to it, and undecorated with polychrome. Usually the figures are applied relief on here. Usually these are stamped, cut, or molded designs on idea what time frame that this piece came from? Come on, guys. 1585, thank you very much. Okay. This talk is taking effect. Okay. Now, remember what I said about the clay? Olive brown. Again, it's not that dark chocolate color that we expect from porcelain. That's the glaze that gives it that appearance. This is the actual color of the clay. So as you examine pieces, one of the most important things to look at on early stoneware is turn it upside down and look at the clay. That will give you a lot of information. Another apostle crude. This only has 6 apostles. This was for somebody who was not quite as religious. Okay. Another apostle crude. Can somebody tell me what's wrong with this picture? The thumb lift, right. This is a thumb lift from a Biedermeier period sign. This large urn shape was typically from 1810 to 1840 and seen a lot of time in the Alpine region as Biedermeier wedding jugs, etc. So this was a lid that was added from something else. Another Croissant. This is the electors. There were 7 electors of the king. The Bishop of Cologne, the Bishop of Mainz, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and I can't remember the others. Trier. Again, another elector's crude. Notice the date here, 1689. Also know that a lot of hysteresis pieces were made, the reproductions of the last century. To me, and I've said it before, one of the most underpriced of the signs. The reproductions are 100 years old. They were all made by hand. They were hand enameled. All the work was done, infinitely more work than a typical print-and-rear blade Metlock, and yet sell for just a fraction above that cost. Very nice piece, but this is a 1600s piece. Another, this is a planet crude. This is a hunting scene, which is fairly rare. Another hunting scene. Very elaborate hunting scene. Lots of molded. All these figures here are in relief. All of this design is in relief. A lot of work involved in that. Isn't that beautiful? As a planet crude. Remember, this enameling is 300 years old. This is probably the rarest of all of the croissants. This is called a Abuntia crude, abundance, which is the cornucopia or horn of plenty. Date on this is the late 1600s. I may have. Isn't that beautiful? And this is also in relief with just a wonderful glaze and wonderful scene on it. Very, very rare. Next factory that I talk about is Duyingen. It's in the northern Germany. It's one of the most northern of the factories. It's south of Hanover. They're usually minimally decorated, like this one is, just with some basic ridge design. Usually olive brown color, reddish brown color, sometimes that honey and red color, and usually from the mid-1700s. These are fairly inexpensive signs and can be bought fairly easily. It's a nice piece. Next we move into Freiburg, which I said was in Saxony, southwest of Dresden. Its clay is a dark gray. It's chip carved. This again was one of these evening projects. There's about 170 cuts in each of these medallions. There's 10 medallions. That's 1,700 cuts. You've got all of this relief work on here. Okay? And you know these guys drank a lot when they went home tonight. You sat there and did 1,700 cuts on a sign and then had to go back tomorrow to do another 1,700. You do it too. Wonderful color to this. The enameling on this is generally thicker than it is on some of the other signs, and it was fired at a little bit higher temperature so that the enamel actually fused together more and it had much more of a glassy texture to it than the applied enamel that you'll see on the croissants. It'll be fused much more together than you would see Another characteristic is this very thin, hand-hammered relief lid. This is a beautiful piece on here with all this chip carving, this wonderful geometric design, the rosette. This still has almost all of the gold intact. Isn't that a beautiful piece? We're talking 1670, 1680 time period. Another piece, this is from the 1670s. Again, notice the lid. I was talking about the thin hammered sheer relief. On this, again, chip carved relief, the glassy enamel and geometric patterns. This is a Tulincon or spout jug, same characteristic. This is a piece from Muskow, and Muskow is east in, as we said earlier, in the Polish area. This piece was from about 1720. This piece is getting later towards the late 1800s or late 1700s. You'll notice on here these diagonal ridges that come up from the base, and they're usually in the lowest portion of the sign, the signs that were bulbous or pear-shaped. That's a large characteristic of that area. You'll see the same thing here on the 1800s piece. And they also have this nice dark blackish high glaze that they'll put on for accent work. This is a Muskow piece. It's the same color clay, but it has had a gray glaze, and then over top a cobalt and a manganese glaze. But again, you see the characteristics of the chip carving, the diagonal bands at the base, and I believe the lid date on this is like 1702. But again, it's not gray. You'll notice under here the color of the clay. So this was a Muskow piece that was made to imitate a Westerwald piece. This is a piece from Rarian. This is a very large krug. It's probably 3-4 liters in size, maybe even larger. It was made by Jan Emmons, and it's dated 1588. This is another piece from Rarian. Again, notice that wonderful nutty brown color. This is called a peasant jug. This is stamp relief or stamp design here, some applied relief, and some pressed molded relief here in the center panel. And a lot of the Rarian pieces have very nice geometric, almost architectural shapes like this does. This is another typical Rarian piece, a very much more common kind of thing, just bands at the base and the top for decoration ridges, a applied bead band here, and then a large shield in the front. And this particular one looks like, okay guys, how old is this one? You guys are getting it. That's great. Okay, now we move to Seaberg, which I said again was southwest of Cologne. And this is a Schnell, which is that tall, tapered shape, has applied panels. A lot of times, Seaberg pieces were not glazed. A lot of them were salt glazed, some were glazed with a little bit of a brownish salt, but that pure white color was very desirable, and sometimes it was not glazed. This is another Seaberg piece. This is from the 1570s. This is called a pullet or bottle shape, also termed, as you can see, on a wheel. And then these large applied medallions. And this has 3 medallions. On the front is Christ on the cross. On the left, on right, is the Last Supper. And on the left is the Christ washing the feet of the disciples. Another Seaberg piece with a Roman motif. This is a Wallenberg, and I would say that part of the reason that they went out of business was design problems like this. Very difficult to be practical with this, but also is excellent. It is a little bit tougher to display on your shelves this way. Now this is a more traditional Waldenberg piece. Waldenberg pottery was very desirable. It was greatly influenced by Seaberg pieces. And the Waldenberg potters did outstanding work. And their product, as I said, was very desirable. All over Germany, as far south into Italy, it was collected because of the quality. Notice this is about a 2-liter size. Notice the wonderful pewter on here. Notice these large relief lion heads which stick out from the body, and very often originally had a pewter ring in the mouth. This is a period piece from about 1570 to 1580. Wonderful detail. Another piece, again with a large shield on the front, and again notice the lines. This one still does have a ring here, here, and here. Isn't that beautiful work? Staying with an applied shield, also same time period, 1570, 1580. Westerwald, which is the region that we're most familiar with, the blue and gray salt clay stoneware. Geometric patterns would be the most common. These are the flowers of the marguerite. It also has some applied diamonds and a band above and below of the center seam for decoration. This is a wonderful piece with incised stoneware geometric designs with a very hard to find solid stoneware lid. This is a beautiful piece. This is another piece from, I'd say, 1730s or so. This has very nice cobalt on here. It's sort of melted together. Hasn't been over-fired, so it hasn't turned that dark Indian ink, black brown, or black ink color. Still sort of shiny mid-blue. And applied relief design. This has some horses on it. So this has a combination of the cobalt enameling, the relief panels, and the incised decoration. You can see a close-up of the detail. A lot of times these were finished with things that looked like dental tools where they would scrape and shape, because it's very difficult to press clay into these molds and to have them come out with great lines to them. So you'll see a lot of times, especially on ones that they wanted to sell for higher prices, that they would spend extra time cleaning these little areas so that it would look better. So another one was sort of an architectural motif. This is a ball or kugel shape. You'll also notice the little rolled handle, which is a sign of some of the earlier pieces, but it was also copied during the Historicism period too. You can see a close-up detail of the relief work on here. In this particular town, everybody goes to church. That's all that's in this town, are churches with people. And we're going to end up here with another rare piece, and this is sort of the rare of the rare. These are gold on silver mounts. This was done at approximately 1530 to 1540, and sort of an absolute elegant piece for something that was really minimally decorated. So on here, the mounts really elevated this from being a relatively common piece into something that would be valued by anybody. Now that's the last of the slides. What I'd like to do is to turn the house lights on, and I'm going to hold up some of the originals, and I'm going to be giving you guys a quiz by giving you some of the characteristics. Okay? I'm going to make it a little bit easier because we're going to try and do it in a time sequence. Okay? Bulbous, lidless, you're not supposed to notice. Bearded man on the front. Cologne War Depression, 1570, 1580 time period. Spotted appearance, gray clay underneath, silver mounts added later. Cologne Freshen, Rhineland area. This is a Tiger Rare jug. Am I getting these right? Seaberg, white, whitish color, bulbous, the fullest shape, applied medallions. This is the one that has Christ on the cross and the Last Supper and washing the feet of the disciples. This is approximately 1570 time period. From the same time period, ridges, beads, applied medallion on the front. Rare. Good. Okay, you're doing good so far. Apostles. 1685. Okay, what's the color of the flag? Don't look. Pardon? Light brown. Okay. Almost always, if they ask anybody a question, what color is the Croatian clay? Oh, it's dark brown. Okay. No, the glaze is dark brown, but the clay is not. Enamel, relief decoration, pear shape, amber. Why? Because I said so. Yeah. Steve and I were joking earlier about this line in the Indiana Jones movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark, and when they're trying to escape from the Nazis and his girlfriend asks him what he's going to do next, and he says, well, I'm making this up as I go. Okay? Sometimes as master psychologist, you answer a question, then you go home and say, now, was that really right? Then you go do your research after you've given your impression. But every once in a while, we have to come back the next year at the convention and say, whoops. But this is definitely an Annenberg piece. Real classic design. And I don't know if you'll be able to tell from here, but can you tell the difference between the matte glaze and the shiny glaze? Okay. So even though the colors are going to be the same, if this had been enameled, these colors of the enameling would be the same, but it's the glaze that gives that away just automatically. Okay? 1685, 1690 to 1700s, that time frame. Applied beads, glaze beads, folk art design called a pearl husband, bands for the pewter, for a fancy pewter, color of the clay. Okay, good. Altenburg, what color clay? Gray. Can you see it? Okay. Again, most people, if you ask, would say, what's the color clay? Well, that's sort of an orangey brown. That is the color clay there. And you'll see on here where this was resting too close to its neighbor in the kiln, so that it didn't get the brown glaze. So you know from this, when was the glaze applied? Wasn't applied beforehand. Lead glaze was applied before it went in the mold. That's the only way it could be done. Okay? This glaze was thrown into the kiln and vaporized, and that's the reason. Otherwise, this would have been painted over top of that. But this was resting next to somebody else. Again, it gives you a little bit of an idea on how something was made that way. This is another, also Altenburg, the white, creamy texture, the applied rosette in that 1725 to 1750 time slot. Again, notice some very nice pewter. When, where? Westerwald, ball-shaped, relief medallions, size decoration, curl on the handle, age, late 16s. Westerwald, relief medallions, lid date 1734. It's compatible. I would say it's likely that it would come from that same time period. Manganese and purple, manganese purple and cobalt blue. Where was this from? Westerwald, the cobalt and manganese, but actually it's Muscal. And again, the clay and the design gives you that. This is another Muscal piece. This is later. This is in the circa 1800 time period. This nice dark blackish glaze, but again we see the same pattern of the ridges on here. Winslow, mid-1700s, double-headed eagle, a sort of applied clay with the white finish on here, the iridescent brown glaze, the white tan actual clay. Another Winslow piece, mid-1700s, diagonal ridges. Another Winslow piece, dark green glaze, late 16, early 1700s, melon shape. A lead glaze, shiny lead glaze, yellow and iron red color. Could be Saxony, could be Dillington. Lid date 1755 probably is accurate. A salt glaze piece, same kind of decoration. This has some wonderful additions to it. They soldered a medallion, a brass medallion to the pewter lids. They've got a brass cap around some of it and a brass plate on top. And they've added a brass and forged that in with a pewter base on there. But really elevate a relatively common sign to something a little bit more elegant. This has a lid date of 1760, which is probably accurate for the piece. And the last is the Newington piece, relatively minimal decoration. This has sort of the olive brown glaze and characteristic large handle, etc. So, anyway, that is going to conclude my talk for the day. The thing that I want you to remember most is the joy of signs. Every one of you who collects signs, whether it is a Metlock, character, a regimental, of the last sign, what Diesinger, HRs, doesn't matter what the category is. Every one of those had their origins with these signs and with this production. So if you're going to be interested in signs, this is going to be your route. Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is John Stuart, and I'm glad you came over here today. My talk is on natural items as drinking vessels. First thing I'd like you to do is just go around and give first names so that I'll know who I'm talking to. I hear Willis get started. Willis? Bill? Bill? Dick? Bob? Bill? Bill? Larry? Pete? John? Roger? John? Roger. Okay. Natural items as drinking vessels were obviously the first thing that was ever used. Well, let's say the second thing that was ever used. This was the first thing as a drinking vessel. Okay. Then anything else that would hold liquid in a drinking vessel. And the basic requirements were that it had to be impermeable to the liquid, not be able to leak. It would need to be large enough to hold at least several gulps of water. It needed to have a mouth that was big enough so that decorate it. Okay? We want to make it a little bit fancier. So over time, we see that people want to embellish the things that they have and elevate something that's very common up to something that's more aesthetically pleasing or interesting. In the Renaissance of the 15 and 1600s, we see this a whole lot because there was a real interest in art and science and traveling. So for the first time, wealthy Europeans, part of their education would have been to travel overseas. They might have gone and sailed to North Africa. They might have sailed to India and the Orient. And so what they decided to do is, well, let's bring back a souvenir with us. So that's when you started seeing things like horns and coconuts and ostrich eggs being used as souvenirs. Now, can you imagine traveling in the 1500s and seeing an ostrich for the first time, never even knowing that such a thing existed? Okay? Well, there's no way in the world that you wouldn't want to take back a souvenir to show that you'd seen this bird. And the only way you could do that was to take back one of the eggs. And one of the things that you'll see in the 15 and 1600s are drinking cups or pokals, usually on a tall stand with a lid that were used for drinking, that were made from ostrich eggs and coconuts and things like that. The late 1800s, in what we call the Historismus period, the historical revival period, they copied a lot of the Renaissance period of drinking vessels and steins. Not in any way to be fraudulent. You'll see in Ron's talk today on the enamel glass, Fritz Heckert had a lot of those armorial beakers and bottles and things, and they'll have dates of 1567 and 1712 and everything. Well, that was not intended to be fraudulent or a fake. What it's just saying is, like, you know how about every 50 years Queen Anne chairs become popular again, so you're just going back to a style that was popular. Well, there was a resurgence of nationalism in the country in the mid-1800s, and Germany started to see itself as a country more than just the number of different states or cities that were part of it. So part of that collective unity was to go back and look at their past and their history. So they started looking at the Renaissance pieces. So this is an ostrich egg copper pokal. This was made in Munich about 1870 to 1890. And most of these are fairly ornate because they're coppering some of the Renaissance pieces. They're fairly complex because you'll see a number of things like this had to be spun on a lathe here. A lot of this cast work was done by hand. This top rim here was cast separately. Each of these filigree things was cast separately. Then all this had to be fitted and soldered together. So this is a piece from about 1870 to 90, pewter-mounted ostrich egg from the Munich area. And I'll pass this around. Most of us love stein-shaped things a little bit more than pokal or urn-shaped things. And I don't know why, but it sort of gets in your head and you say, oh, well, it's not a stein. Well, in drinking vessels, only from natural items, only a small percentage of things actually were used in the shape of a stein. So this is another piece, also from Munich, also in that 1870 to 1890 time period, with ostrich egg as a stein. And this has a very stylized dolphin as the thumb lift on here. And the reason I say stylized, the face is a little bit different, almost like a gargoyle, and it has scales on it, which a dolphin doesn't have scales. But this is a piece, like I said, that combined some of the natural items with some of the work done in the late 1800s. One of the things that people brought back to them, with them from their travels, were coconuts. And again, do you just want to set a coconut up on the shelf hoping that your friends will be impressed when you come in, or do you want to really impress them? Well, we're going to take the coconut that we got in Africa and we're going to bring it back and we're going to take it down and have the jewelry store or the silversmith in the area turn that into a stein. And this particular piece is most likely from the 1600s, but it could be a hysterismus piece. It's very difficult on these with unmarked silver because so many things were copied in such great style in the late 1800s. It's very difficult. I was telling the last group that I had talked to an antique dealer in New York City several different times, and one time I was up there and he said, well, he was going to get this coconut stein mounted in silver and a coin stein, and he showed me the photographs and asked if I was interested, and I said, absolutely. So about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was a counselor at a mental health agency. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he called and said, well, he just picked him up, but he was leaving at 10 o'clock the next morning to do an antique show in New Orleans, so I would have to be there when he opened up in the morning. And I think part of the reason was he'd already quoted me the price on that, and I think he knew that he'd be able to get much more money. But I took the next day off from work. I drove up to New York. I slept the night in a police station. I was there when he opened at 8 o'clock in the morning, so I got my coconut. About 10 years later, when I bought my house, I sold the coconut to Werner Somm for the Rostel Museum. And I think he likes it because it's on the front cover of his catalog. So always sort of dejected that I had to get rid of it. And then Bill Fry from California called me about 2 years ago and said, would you be interested in a coconut hairstyle? And I said, absolutely. So anyway, he brought it for me, and everything from here to here is exactly the same. Everything. This same scene, everything. I compared it to my old photographs under a magnifying glass, and most likely it was made by the same person, and there's a good chance that it could be late 1600s. But like I said, you can always make things in an older style. The handle on the one that I had was different. It was a large hollow cast, which is something that they rarely did in the hysterismus period. They did tend to go with the more solid cast in the hysterismus period. So it could be a copy of the early piece. I can't tell. But I was tickled to death to be able to get my coconut stein back again. Pass it around. Another thing that was used as natural items were stone. You'll see things made out of, this is serpentine. You'll see them made out of agate. You'll see them made out of jasper and other naturally occurring marble pieces. So this style was used a lot in Saxony in the late 1600s, 1680 to 1710 time period. The bulk of them were mounted in pewter. Some of them were mounted in silver. And I've got a couple different ones in my collection. This particular one most likely is also a hysterismus piece, about 1870, but again, it could be a late 16, early 1700s piece. The serpentine stone is turned on a lathe, both inside and outside, and to me, it's very elegant. Doing this with the silver, I think, just creates a wonderful contrast between the natural stone, and if you'll look at this closely, you'll see there's a number of different, like reddish and brownish stellas in here, so there's really some depth of field to it. I'm going to pass this around, but this base rim is loose, so when you do pass it from each other, you can hold the base on. Yeah.
How long was that hysterismus period stand?
Generally from about 1860 to about 1900. And after 1900, the bulk of the work went into either the traditional kinds of things that were being made or the Art Nouveau kinds of things. You very rarely see any of the Renaissance Revival period pieces after that 1900 time slot. Prior to the 1800s, you were either real rich or real poor, and there really wasn't much of a middle class. Part of the reason that we see the proliferation of metlocks and character steins at the turn of the century was, for the first time in, say, starting around the 1850s, and it was the same thing in this country, there was a middle class. People were manufacturing. People were working. People were not just working on the farm. So their people had money to spend, and they bought souvenirs. And that's what the character signs and the metlocks were meant for, is more the new middle class who wanted to buy very nice quality things to set around, but who didn't have the money to be buying ivory and gold and silver, things like that. This is an ivory tankard that was made in the 1700s, and you can see it's carved in a battle scene and cherub finial. This is brass that at one time was gold wash, and almost all the gold is gone. Ivory is a natural material, so it dries out over time. You'll notice when I hold this up to the light, can you see how thin the ivory is in sections? Okay? You're talking a very small quarter of an inch or so. Well, what happens, ivory is an organic material, and it will dry. Well, when it's already this thin and it dries, it means you're going to have splits and cracks in it. And if you're going to collect or have some ivory steins, you don't want things that are broken apart, but it's just almost impossible to find something that does not have some age cracks or splits, etc. One of the things that you should or could do when you have a piece of ivory like this or some wood is set a dish with some water in it next to it or even inside, and it'll add a little bit of humidity to the environment. Something that you can do to speed that up is if you'll take one of those little plastic dishes like that you get for butter or spreads or things like that, and fill it with water. It'll generally take a couple of weeks before it evaporates. If you put a sponge in it and cut it round to be the same size as that, it'll generally evaporate in 2 or 3 days, which means that much more water is getting into the air. So if you do that, put a sponge in it, just a natural thing that you can buy, cut it to the right shape, pour it with water, and you'll put much more moisture into the environment, and you'll reduce that. I'm not going to pass this one around, but this is a 1700s piece, and again, would have been made for somebody who was very, very affluent at the time that it was made. This is another coconut. This is late 1800s, and has English hallmarks on the bottom, pewter. Typically in the early time period, these pieces were held together by 3 straps. Let me go ahead and borrow this back for a second. And the base is cast separately, this neck rim is cast separately, each of these straps is kept separately. There's a little hook on the back of this that loops over the top and holds it down. Then what happens is they will then trim this piece here, the base piece here, to the right length and solder on a hinge there and put a pin in. So almost all the ones that you see from the 15 and 1600s will have 3 straps, and almost all of them will have a hinge with a pin going through, and that's how they mounted them together and would fit around an irregular surface. A lot of the Hysterismus periods copied the 3 or 4 strap style, but you will almost never see them with the hinge pins coming through. At this stage, they just soldered the pieces together. I'll pass that around. Wood is another item that was obviously used for a long period of time. This particular piece is Scandinavian. This is probably Danish. It's about 1750. This is turned on a lathe. These ridges on here were left on the lathe, and then this one ridge was then cut down separately to form all of these little knobs on here. So all that was separate work that was done by hand. Same thing on the edge of the lid. You'll notice the carving on the lid. It has sort of a stylized lion and with a chainmail armor, and usually will have a crown on. And then typically like this, the thumb lift will be the same thing. It will also be a lion. It will also have the chainmail armor. Will also have a crown on. Usually we'll have a large hinge like this, and then a tapering handle that has some minor engraving and a heart-shaped finial at the bottom. And again, to me, that's quite elegant. All this is carved from one piece of wood. This is one piece. And I'm going to pass this around. This is dry. Yeah, this is Scandinavian, probably Denmark. A third of an inch, quarter of an inch, third.
Yeah. Would these usually be done in bronze?
Usually would be done in burl, but not always. As opposed to being made out of one piece like that was, they also had stave tankards. And each of these is put together just like a barrel is. There's about 8 different wedges that are set in here. Now this is another Scandinavian piece. This is from the late 1800s, but it's a copy of a 1600s piece. And this is chip carved, where they gouge out all of these little lines on here. You can see it on the roof, or the lid of the stein. And you'll also notice that this was stained with color, yellows and greens and reds and things like that, very decorative. And these are relatively moderately priced. Most of these you can find from the turn of the century or in that maybe $100 to $300 category. And to me, it's a real nice part of history. I like the ones that are stained. They're much less common. I would say that maybe 10 to 15% of the ones that you'll see are stained, but they're very nice, interesting pieces. And they're put together with the barrel, or like a barrel with the hoops on them. This is another type of wood stein. This comes from the Black Forest region, about 1870. It's a briar root that's been drilled all the way through to make it round like that. And then on the bottom, they've turned a cap on the lathe and nailed it together so that it forms a base and it will hold liquid. This D-shaped handle is carved separately, and it's attached to it. The lid is another piece of briar root. The thumb lift is another little piece that they've whittled down as a wedge that comes through and is held in here. And even this little finial is a separate piece that's drilled through and set in. My wife hates this stein. She thinks it's the ugliest one I have. I have to admit that it is at least interesting. I don't know that I'd go with ugly. And one of the interesting things was I promised her that I would never get another one. This would be the only one. But then I was at an antique show and I saw another one and I thought, no, it's a different size. So I have my half liter and my 1 liter burl root, and she's just praying that they don't make 2 and 3 liter burl roots on here. But to me, it's a little bit interesting. Yeah, I'm going to pass this one around also. This lid is real loose on here, so don't open the. Excuse me. Also in the Black Forest region, 1870 to 1890, you'll see this type of tankard. And this is sort of a typical Capodimoni style scene, a Bacchanalian festival. And there's maybe 15 different figures that are carved in here. You'll see some of the kids over here, they're climbing the tree. This person's trying to grab this kid who's climbing the tree. All different kinds of things on here. There's a full figure on the lid and 3 other people on here. One of the things that's a little bit unusual about this is this was carved from 2 pieces of wood that were glued together and then turned on a lathe. So this whole thing was turned around on a lathe first after the 2 pieces were glued together. The inside was then drilled, and then it's given to the carver who carves this scene. Typically, things like the handles and the feet were carved by the apprentices. There's no sense in paying the master to take the time to carve a relatively common handle. So one of the things as part of the apprentice system was you started doing usually menial tasks, which was like sweeping up the sawdust and doing things like that. And then you kept training a little bit more. Then you would start learning to maybe turn on a lathe, but just turn the round parts on here, or just carve the feet. So usually the handles and feet are less ornate than the body, and usually the handles and feet, when they're less ornate, were done by the apprentices as opposed to the carver. On some of these, you can actually tell whether the person was left-handed or right-handed when they do it, because you tend to always start from the same side if you're left-handed or right-handed. And I have had a couple that I've seen where you could tell that the apprentice was left-handed and the master was right-handed. It's sort of an oddity that drives wives crazy when you sit up at midnight trying to figure out things like that. But to me, it's sort of fun. So to me, this is a very interesting piece. I like its style, and it basically has pretty pleasing proportions for being done out of wood.
Did you say when that was about when that was made?
1870 to 1890, Black Forest region also. And I think it's walnut. but I think the size makes it real attractive. Leather was used a lot in England in the 15 and 1600s, and these leather tankards were called blackjacks, because most of the leather was tan black. They usually, like this, have a stitched handle, and the base is also stitched around here. Very frequently on the inside, they have pitch or tar, because leather and having liquid inside, it would just start deteriorating in a very short period of time. So they would put the pitch inside to keep the water from getting in. Now, I don't know about you, but have you ever smelled, can you imagine drinking from pitch? And other than some of the really bitter ales that I've had in England, it's the only possible reason that they would have put the pitch inside and drunk from it would be to cover up the ale, which was worse. Otherwise, I can't believe doing it. This particular piece was made in the United States, and this was a trophy for a yacht club or something like that in 1908, but it's the exact style or copy of a 1600s blackjack. And I'll just pass this around without that. Another type of leather stein is this, and this is japanned enameled leather. Did any of you go on one of the earlier conventions to Dr. Zarent's house? Okay, you remember that collection? Well, anyway, this was one of his pieces, and I came out of there and just saying, oh, that's absolutely fantastic. And Ron Fox and I, every year or two, would say, hey, do you remember this leather tankard at Dr. Zarent's house? And so anyway, when his collection was sold in New York City at auction, I went up and I was fortunate enough to be able to get this. I'm not going to pass this around, but when you do come up, if you want to pick it up, that's okay. But you'll be amazed at just how light it is. There's almost nothing to it. The lid is dated GMS 1769. I would say that it's authentic. There's some documentation on here that it was sold at an auction in England in the late 1800s. And as far as I know, it's a one-of-a-kind. I've never seen any in the museum. I've never seen any that were from other people. That doesn't mean that there aren't many more of them, but I don't know of any, and I don't know anybody else who has seen that. But to me, that's just a very interesting piece. A different type of leather is shark skin, okay? And this is a silver piece that was made in New York City in 1896. It's documented. It has beautiful silver mounts on here. It's sort of the classic English style of the thumb lift, the wave, and the reverse C scroll with the shield finial on the bottom. And I'll ask you to open the stein up for me. Okay. Now, I'll ask you to open it again for me. Can't do it. For whatever reason, this person had it made with a locking mechanism. This lid rotates a quarter of a turn and locks and unlocks. Okay?
Probably for traveling.
Could be for traveling, could be for drug smuggling, it could be that he was cheating on his wife and he had his girlfriend's phone numbers in here, but for whatever reason, it was made, and obviously made very specifically. But I've never seen another one that had that kind of a mechanism to it. I think the contrast of the color of the shark skin and the silver makes that real elegant looking. And yet it's something that was just made by a very natural item. If somebody said, hey, you want a fish skin stein? You know, you'd say, oh, God, you know, it sounds gross. I'd never do that. As a copy of an ivory stein, this is meerschaum. And meerschaum is a stone that's found, like I believe, in the Aegean or Caspian Sea area. And you'll see this frequently carved for pipes. It's a very light material. It's porous. One of the reasons that it works real well for pipes is because of all the little air pockets. It's a good insulator, so it doesn't really get that hot when it's in your hand as a pipe. And really nice sized chunk of meerschaum. The two that I have were both made by Elkington and Company. I know of two others. Jim Stevenson has one. Jim DeMars has one. Both of those are marked Elkington and Company. In England, probably the mid-1800s. This particular one is gold-plated brass on it. And on the bottom, it says nothing out there. From the original ivory in the possession of Henry C. G. Bedford, Esquire, executed by Elkington Mason and Company, number 1348. Now, this is not as valuable as an ivory stein, but you will see a fraction of the number of meerschaum steins to the number of ivory steins that you see. And again, to me, this is something that's very elegant. You're taking a stone, beautifully carving it, mounting it, and I think it's quite elegant. This is another meerschaum stein, also made in the mid-1800s by Elkington Company. And you'll notice this is a Turkish caravan scene, and this darkening on here is not just from dirt over time. This was stained a little bit dark to look like wood carving. So on this one, this was kept real white so it would look like ivory carved, and this was stained a little bit dark so that this would look like wood carving. Now, I don't know about you, but I love the meerschaum. I don't know why they felt the need to do it, but that's okay with them. And they kept that particular style. Has a lion or panther for the finial on here, sort of a Turkish man. Has a finial for the handle. And the detail of the carving is not quite as nice as the other, but the overall size and motif, I think, makes it very unusual. At one point in time, you can tell that they had done some soldering here because it darkened the gold on this part and part of the handle, which is a real shame, but I really don't want to do anything about it. But quite... No, it shouldn't. I mean, it can crack and it can get chips in it, but it usually takes something hitting it to do it. It doesn't dry out like the ivory or wood would. Okay, this is a horn. This is probably 1870 to 1890 time period. It's German, and again, you can see it's relatively thin. See the light come through? Okay, and relatively common design. Oak leaves and acorns, one of the good luck symbols of Bavaria. A staghorn button for a finial, and just a nice little interesting piece. I don't know how many of you saw my article in Prosit on horns. This is a Heidelberg Student Fraternity horn, and this was made by the Württemberg Metal Fabric Company, WMF, 1870, 1880 time period. It's silver plated, and to me it's quite elegant. See the detail on that? Horns were used especially during Viking times. They were supposed to have the magical property of telling if a drink were poisoned, and also supposed to promote virility. It wasn't a rumor about the telling if a drink was poisoned. Horns being organic matter, if arsenic is put in there, it will foam, and so that wasn't just a superstition. The virility part, I think that was a superstition, but I'm not about to chop it up and find out. Maybe if I get a little bit older, it might be worthwhile, but not at this stage. Do you all have any questions about this? Yeah.
Is there anything you can put on ivory to protect it?
Not really. There's lemon oil that you use for furniture, okay? And I've heard some people said that they put lemon oil on with a toothbrush. I'm pretty much of a purist. I don't do anything to it. I just keep moisture, as much moisture as possible in the area, and try to handle it as infrequently as possible. One of the things that happens is you get oils from your hand, or you put oils on, and it attracts dust and dirt. Okay? If it's kept clean and doesn't have oil to it, it generally will not attract as much dirt. So what you see as stains in here came from people probably handling it and touching it this way. When you do have ivory, especially if it has metal mounts, you should always try and handle it from the base of the handle, and to keep your touching of the ivory part of it as you touch it as little as possible, and it will keep it a little bit better. Ivory has, being natural, has a lot of swirls and textures and things to it, and it's really interesting to see sometimes the way that they've worked the natural grain, like the grain of the wood, they've worked the natural grain of the ivory into the scene. That's usually a sign of real skilled workmanship. Ivory very frequently has the same thing that we were talking about the apprenticeship system. You'll typically see the master would have carved the basic scene, and probably one of the apprentices would have carved the finial, or especially the handles. On ivories that have no metal mounts, the entire thing's ivory, they'll usually rest on 3 feet or so, or it'll have a flat disc bottom. Usually the bottom is made of 3 or 4 different pieces that are all pinned together, and then you've got the central part of the tusk, and then sometimes they'll even have a lip rim that'll be pinned on, and then the finial and lid will be on top of that. And finial and lid sometimes will be 3 or 4 separate pieces, all either glued or pegged together. One of the hallmarks of the 15 and 1600s ivories is the finial and lid is much larger in proportion. From the 15 and 1600s, the lid is 1/3 or more the height of the body. So when you'll go into a museum and you'll see a 15 or 1600s piece, the body will be this big and the lid will be about that big. And as we get to the end of the 1700s, and almost always with the historismus, the historical pieces, generally the ivory is anywhere between 10 and 20%, or the lid is anywhere between 10 and 20% of the height of the stein, as opposed to the 1/3 of the stein it is that you see in the 15 and 1600s. But as I was telling the other group about something else, it's very much like a paternity suit. It's easier to prove that it's not from the 1500s than it is to prove that it is from the 1500s, because you can go back and copy any style you want to. Okay? You know that there was no Art Nouveau being made in the 1700s. But there can be stuff that's made today or in the Art Nouveau period that's a copy of the 15 and 1600 pieces. If they're willing to take the time, they can copy it exactly. There's no reason in the world, if you have a tusk of ivory and you have a good carver, that you cannot carve anything that you want. You can put any date on it that you want. Anybody, if you wanted to, could go to the jewelry store and have your initials and the date of 1511 or whatever else you wanted put in on the metal. So dates on the mounts are much less reliable than dates on the body, but again, that's not an absolute. Because I could take this one on the front and have somebody carve in the year 1311. And I'm sure all of you know the joke about seeing a coin that had 1300 BC. Yeah.
Getting back to the ivory cleanup, there's some ivories that are quite dirty.
Uh-huh.
Cleaning it up with just a detergent.
Okay. Typically in something like that, I would use Murphy's oil soap, diluted very, like 1 part to 10. I would make sure that the water was warm, basically room temperature, not hot, not cold. I would use a long, soft bristle toothbrush and would do it a little bit at a time and then rinse it right away and not leave any of the soap on it, okay? But something would have to be pretty foul before I would do that, okay? Sometimes you can take, because a lot of times the dirt sticks in certain places, like these little crevices, and sometimes just taking a little bit of a moistened Q-tip, you can go in and dislodge the dirt from the areas where it's fairly thick and noticeable, and to me that would be, if there's not a whole lot of it, that would be a preferable way of cleaning it than washing the whole thing. But if you would do it, and if I did have an ivory piece that was just really dirty and foul, I would do something like the Murphy's oil soap, diluted 1 part in 10, room temperature water, soft toothbrush, and then as soon as you're done the cleaning part, rinse it real well, and then dry it with a flannel cloth, get the moisture out of it right away, because you don't want to put moisture into it to expand and then know that it's going to evaporate in a few days and would dry again. So you don't want the moisture to seep into the ivory itself, because you'll just create different expansion and contraction problems.
You do polish silver. Do you worry about the polish?
I only polish the silver when I'm given a talk. So, usually, it's like every 2, 3, 4 years if I haul something out. Ginny always makes fun of me. I was up at 11 o'clock the night before we left shining the silver on here. Around my house, they'll sit that way and be absolutely fine for years. But they look a little bit zippier when you're showing them to have them all cleaned up. If something is sterling silver, there's, to me, much less concern about it. If something's silver plate, depending on how much plating material is on there, it's not long on some of the plate, the interior metal can be stained. So, I mean, this is silver plate. This isn't sterling. So if I polish this on a 6-month basis, it's not going to be that long before we start seeing that there's no silver on parts of this. Whereas this being solid silver and this being solid silver, I would have much less concern polishing these because the thickness is, you know, 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, etc. And you may over time reduce the details. But usually what you reduce on details comes from the thin engraving that is not very deep, okay? Sort of a scratch surface, and that, by shining that continually, you can wear that surface away. Something that has this much relief on this, which is fairly high, there's no real way we're going to do that. One of the ways that you can reduce the damage when you shine is taking a soft, natural sponge and using something like Haggerty's Silver Foam, and using the sponge, never using toothbrushes or anything that's strong at all. The soft sponge will fit into the crevices. You can use that to wipe, and it doesn't abrade nearly as much as something else where you would use cloth and a polish, where you're putting polish has the grit in it, and you're rubbing like that with a cloth. Well, that's actually scouring the surface. What you're hoping to do with this is to just take the oxidation off of the surface. So I find that something like Haggerty Silver Foam and a natural sponge that's real wet, and don't let it stay on real long. Slop it on for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll take it back off. It's usually enough. None of these took me more than a couple minutes to do, and all of them I do that way. So I find that by doing that way, I don't think that there's going to be that much damage. I'd be much more concerned about doing it with a plated piece than I would a solid silver.
I was also thinking about the Austin Day. That silver polish in paint.
They can stain. What you're taking off with the silver polish is silver oxide, which is black, and this being porous, if you get the dirt on here, those stains can stay, and you can't get them out. Ivory is the same way. I've seen people who really screwed up ivories that had silver mounts by just working real hard on getting the silver all clean with a toothbrush. But what happens is that foam of the silver oxide and the junk, well, you've seen even silver that's polished, if you don't wipe the polish off, that nice white crud that's on there, well, that gets into the pores of ivory. You can't get it back out of it.
I think that's what I was addressing.
Oh, okay.
Silver,
Yeah.
That you could ruin the piece, by polishing the silver.
Right.
Very, very happy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If I were going to do this, which I'm not, I would probably tape plastic over this so that none of the stuff would be able to come in contact with it, and then work around this and not getting close to the ivory. I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. Because when this, like I said, you're talking about dirt, oxide, and chemicals, and grit, and porous material. Yeah.
Do you think that the ivory stein was in the auction the other day, the one that was stained, was all those something like that, or was it delivered to these things?
I don't know. I didn't look at it. I looked at the estimates.
But this is the type of material that once you stain it, I mean, it's...
In Scandinavia,
it's like marble.
Yeah. They would buy ivory from the Orient, bring it to Norway, Sweden, stain it brown so that it would look like great wood carving.
But that's
but that's them.
That's the way
You'll
it
see
was.
stuff that's stained colors, where they put greens and reds and whatever, the same way you would paint a scene. I've seen it stained that way. To me, that detracts from it. But again, if you're looking for a certain part of history, and let's say that I want a good representation of ivory, and I've got this one which is decorated in the traditional style, and then I've got this one which is decorated in the Norwegian Scandinavian style with the staining, and then I've got this one that's done in the Italian style with the polychrome colors on there, and if I wanted to collect ivory and show examples, that would be good to
That's
do that.
the way it was.
Right, but to just go out and do it, I'm sort of a purist on it. I like the way it looked natural.
With wood, it has a tendency to crack also. The normal environment in a home prevent that, or you need to put out moisture.
Moisture too. Our modern technology is awful. You go from 80 degrees or 80% humidity in your house in the summer frequently to 10 or 15, especially if you've got forced hot air heat, 20% humidity in the wintertime. It's with your furniture too. I mean, I tell people all the time at the antique shop, you need to put something like lemon oil in there. People will do the surface of a piece, they'll never do the base or legs or whatever. A lot of times you want to take this stuff out twice a year in spring and fall, put a lot of the lemon oil on, let it sit overnight, wipe it off with a soft cloth the next day, and keep moisture in there. If you have the ability to put a dehumidifier on a furnace system, that's really good, because you can put a humidifier on in the winter and dehumidifier on in the summer and have much less variation. The temperature doesn't bother it nearly as much as the change in humidity. I mean, how many of us, as we're getting older, can tell differences in humidity in our joints and things like that? Well, it's the same thing. I mean, it's either humid or it's not humid, and you can feel those kind of differences. It can be real debilitating to organic materials. Any other questions?
I've got a drinking horn, a hanging one, and I don't believe it was originally meant for drinking out because the top band is riveted to the horn itself rather than being glued or fastened or something.
Okay.
But
That's not the way that you'd be able to tell. Some of these were fastened by glue, some of these were fastened by pins or screws, okay? That was just sort of the designer's way of doing it. It's the rim that tells you whether it was intended to be drunk from or not. Things that have a very large outward flare, you can't get your mouth around it, you can't drink from it. Things that have a very large, thick, rolled lip, you can't use it, okay? You can't drink from it. Ones that come up fairly straight usually have a little bit of a collar to them, because with this kind of detail on here, you can't drink from this part of it, okay? You can't, unless this slides out, which a lot of them do. This would be the only portion that you could drink from over there. So you can sort of see the way it's decorated, whether it was intended to be used or not. Now this one, look at this rim, okay? I mean, you'd be drooling down the front of yourself with this, because there's no way that you could get that lid or get your mouth around that to drink from. So a lot of times, just by looking at shape, you can tell whether something was intended to be used or at least usable. Now things like this were very expensive. Okay, this was not the kind of thing that you're, taking down to the game room and just drink from all evening. These were things like I'd give it to you and your wife for a wedding present or for a 30th anniversary or something, and they may have been drunk from once and gone up on the mantle. But none of this quality stuff was ever intended to be used on a regular basis. Something like this was. This was regularly intended to be used. This was regularly intended to be used. These somewhat. Usually the ones that are about 1 liter were intended to be used. The smaller ones were generally more the souvenir size, okay? These don't hold a whole lot of liquid in there. And the Scandinavian ones, the ones that at least with people that I've talked to, ones that are this size were more intended to be used. One of this size was more intended for ornamentation on there. But again, it's not an absolute. I mean, we can always drink from things that people tell us, well, don't drink from that, and We always have things that you think you should do it.
This may be a dumb question, but how do you determine left-handed, right-handed?
The way the chips go, which way you start, okay? Because you see where the thickness starts and where the end point is, the groove, okay? It's real hard, if you're right-handed, to make these grooves going that way, okay? So typically, if I'm right-handed, you sort of always start and carve that way around it, and if you're left-handed, you sort of always start and carve that way around it. Now, a lot of them like this, it's real hard to tell, because a lot of this carving is straight on, which is easy, to do, because you can move your hand this way too. But I'm just saying, when you see the way when they all start, and you go all the way around, and they all start from the same side, you can usually make some assumptions on here. But like I said, those are the things that when you're sitting there having a whole bunch of beers at 11 o'clock at night, those are the things that are fun to think about. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, back to my horn.
Uh-huh.
The question I had, mine's the furniture at the mounting are a combination of pewter and brass.
Uh-huh.
And it has kind of a grungy brown patina to the whole thing. I mean, it's consistent with the brass and the pewter. So do you think that was something that was done to it originally, or might have been silver plated?
Could have easily been silver plated. Yeah. You just have to tell, it can be pot metal, it can be brass, it can be copper, it can be pewter, and be silver plated. Typically, specific companies use specific styles. Typically, WMF used pewter and used pot metal and silver plated that. Other companies used a lot of copper and brass and silver plated that. So it just depends on the manufacturer and the time period. Okay, well, I want to thank you for being here. I think the biggest message that I want to give to you is the fact that I know that there's a lot of people who are Metlock collectors and character collectors and regimental collectors, but to me, the whole range of steins and drinking vessels includes everything. And that includes the most common items like wood, or the most elegant items like ivory. To me, there's always a beauty in the way that we've been able to combine nature and art. And if you want to play with any of them, do so. But only in this room.